花180万买的顶楼50楼的房子。
I bought a penthouse on the 50th floor for 1.8 million yuan, and living here feels like I'm in the sky every day. I regret it so much that I want to slap myself. I'm beyond frustrated. There are just too many issues, too many flaws. No matter what, I'll never buy a top floor unit of any ultra high-rise apartment again.
不要再去买高层了，我现在住的就是高层。
Do not buy high-rise apartments. I live in one, and I can't take it anymore. My building has 29 floors, and I live on the 28th. This is my 5th year here. When I bought the apartment, I didn't know the downsides of high-rises. I thought a higher floor meant better views and lighting, but within 3 months, I found countless problems. First, the noise. I assumed living higher up would reduce traffic and square dancing noise, but it's even clearer. Second, the dust is terrible. You wouldn't believe it unless you experienced it. Third, the signal is unstable, making calls break up, and even simple messages take forever to send. Fourth, high-rise buildings are overcrowded. After dinner, the community is packed, the environment is poor, and green spaces are minimal. Lastly, the share space ratio is huge, typically 25 to 30%. A 90 square meter apartment has only about 60 square meters of usable space, meaning I spent over 200,000 yuan on shared areas.
As China's real estate market continues to collapse, high-rise apartments, once a symbol of prestige, have fallen from grace. More and more residents are moving out, opting for pricier low-rise buildings instead of staying in high-rises. Some even believe that these buildings, which once stood as monuments to China's economic boom, will eventually become worthless.
听我说，
Listen, 30 years from now, high-rise apartments will be worthless. People spend their youth and generations paying off mortgages, only to realize they've been deceived. Sellers and developers never mention the fatal flaw. In the future, no one will buy them. Economic and demographic factors, especially in smaller cities, will drive this reality.
There are 3 main reasons why high-rise apartments will become unmarketable. First, their design lifespan is only 50 years. Once a building is over 10 years old, it faces issues like peeling walls, aging pipelines, elevator maintenance, and roof or exterior wall leaks. The repair costs for high-rises are extremely high, and the maintenance funds collected from residents won't be enough to sustain them for long. Second, China's urbanization rate has exceeded 60%, with people flocking to major cities. In contrast, high-rise apartments in smaller countries are being abandoned. This is particularly true in sparsely populated regions where there is no demand for them. Third, the birth rate has plummeted in recent years. Many millennials and Gen Zers are voluntarily choosing a 3-no lifestyle. No mortgage, no car loan, and no children. With their grandparents and parents typically leaving behind 1 or 2 properties, future generations will have no interest in buying high-rises. Even those looking for better housing will opt for low-rise buildings or garden-style apartments instead. Some people argue that they don't need to wait for the future. Just look at the state of high-rise buildings from the 1980s to see how bleak their fate will be.
有人说高层住宅最后都会被沦
Some say that high-rise apartments will eventually turn into slums. Is this true or false? Let me tell you a story and you'll understand. In Shijiazhuang, there's a building that was constructed in 1986. It has 16 floors and now nearly 40 years old. The building originally had 2 elevators, but only one is still operational, as the other one is too old. If both elevators break down at the same time, residents are left with no way to get upstairs. The one functioning elevator only stops at 4 floors: 1st, 6th, 9th, and 15th, and frequently malfunctions. Beyond elevator failures, the building has aging electrical wiring, which poses fire and water leakage risk. Water supply is another major issue, along with problems in maintaining the building's cleanliness. The majority of residents are elderly, as younger people with financial means have long moved out, leaving behind lower-income residents who have no choice but to stay. More and more high-rise residents are now realizing what the future holds for these buildings.
都说高层住宅
People say high-rise apartments will become slums in 30 years. I didn't believe it until I saw my own community. Our complex was completed in 2022, just 3 years ago. Back then, the grass was lush and green. Now, patches of bare dirt are everywhere. The artificial lake, once a highlight, has turned into a foul-smelling drainage pond. The worst issue is the overwhelming number of electric scooters. The developer promised a pedestrian-friendly community with underground car parking, but failed to mention designated scooter parking, which is severely lacking. In this 50-story complex with thousands of residents, scooters now fill every available space. Many homeowners have also stopped paying property fees, leading to worsening service. Initially, security was strict, but now the south gate is unguarded, making the area unsafe. Then there's the exterior. Sales staff claimed that outer walls would last 50 years, but paint is already chipping after just 3. Someone once told me that ultra-high-rise buildings age faster than other housing. Seeing this, I'm starting to believe that in 30 years, high-rise apartments will really become slums.
高层住宅未来会变为贫民窟吗？
Will high-rise apartments eventually become slums? Let's take a look at the current situation in the United States. In New York, 90% of high-rise apartments are occupied by low-income residents, while the wealthy lives in suburban villas. As buildings age, high-rise residents face numerous challenges such as weak water pressure requiring secondary pumping, fire safety risk, and frequent elevator malfunctions and power outages. So, are you still considering buying a high-rise apartment? At the end of 1970s, China's built its first high-rise residential complex in Shanghai. By the 2000s, high-rises had spread to cities at all levels. China's high-rise apartments are a product of their time, inspired by the Khrushchev-style housing from the Soviet era. Back then, entire buildings were occupied by employees of the same workplace who lived and worked together. Living in a high-rise was considered an honor, with names like Steel Factory Compound or Armed Police Barracks. Today, however, apart from Singapore and China, few countries still rely on high-rise buildings for residential purposes. According to the experience of developed nations, high-rises are unsuitable for long-term living. They are typically used for offices, temporary housing, or single individuals, or specialized accommodations. Over time, high-rise apartments lose both their investment value and resale appeal. In some ways, they resemble the tulip bubble, once seen as valuable only to become a regrettable investment decades later. In 20 years, reselling these properties will be a major challenge, as the cost of demolition and reconstruction is often higher than simply developing a new area. In the coming decades, high-rise apartments in smaller cities will turn into ghost towns, while those in major cities will become low-rent urban village. While China grants a 70-year land use right, most high-rises are only designed to last 50 years. This means that homeowners won't even reach the end of their land tenure before their buildings deteriorate, making high-rise apartments one of the biggest real estate traps. In an interview, Li Xiaojiang, former president of the China Academy of Urban Planning and Design, made a striking statement saying that high-rise apartments will become one of the heaviest burdens on Chinese society. So why, despite knowing that high-rise apartments will become urban waste in the future, does China continue to build so many of them? First, high-rise construction is a way for the Chinese government to showcase national strength and project an image of prosperity to attract global talent. Over the past 2 decades, the government has fueled economic growth by heavily investing in real estate development. However, with limited land and a massive population, building only low-rise housing would hinder urbanization. More importantly, since the economic reforms, urbanization has been a top priority. With millions of rural residents migrating to the cities, land shortages have intensified. High-rises maximize land use by increasing the total floor area that can be sold, leading to higher prices while also addressing urban land constraints. From a short-term perspective, this strategy offers multiple benefits. The second issue, according to Li, lies in the system that relies on land finance and GDP-based performance assessments. On one hand, local government aims to maximize revenue from land sales, while developers seek profits. This has led to increasingly dense and taller residential buildings. High-rise and ultra-high-rise apartments have become the dominant form of new housing in cities, pushing residential floor area ratios even higher. On the other hand, under the GDP assessment system, local government go to great lengths to attract business investment. As a result, they offer industrial land at extremely low prices, sometimes even giving it away for free. This has led to a stark imbalance in urban land use. Residential areas are packed with high-rises, while industrial land is often inefficiently utilized. Essentially, revenue from commercial and residential real estate is used to subsidize industrial land, which in turn drives up housing prices, making high-rise developments even more financially attractive. There's no denying that Lee's analysis is correct, but it's worth considering, was there ever an alternative path to urbanization besides a high-rise expansion model? To answer this question, we have to go back to China's 1994 tax reform. After the tax sharing reform, local governments found themselves with a mismatch between fiscal authority and spending responsibilities. To address funding shortages, they had two options: expand the tax base or find alternative source of revenue. Since tax rates were set at the national level, local governments had to focus on developing local industry and commerce to broaden their tax base. In addition, they aggressively competed to attract investment from other regions, effectively poaching businesses. Across China, local governments follow the same strategy. For years, they rolled out increasingly generous tax breaks and land policies, from 3 years tax-free, 2 years at half rate, or even 5 years tax-free with further negotiations. They offered everything from land rebates to completely free industrial land and ever-increasing equipment subsidies. Some local governments even set up dedicated industrial funds to support businesses. The logic was simple: attracting a major corporation meant securing a wealth stream for local tax revenue. As for non-tax revenue, the primary source was land sales. As cities grew, more people moved in, making housing a necessity and increasing land value. By artificially inflating the price of residential land, local governments could still fill fiscal gaps and offset the losses from offering the industrial land at low or zero cost. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. The 1994 tax reform set the process in motion, and one of its most visible outcomes is China's forest of high-rise today. In short, China's urban landscape was shaped by its economic system. However, the tax sharing reform also had unintended consequences, the most notable being land finance dependency. At its peak, some local governments relied on land sales for more than half of their revenue. Now, as the real estate market declines, local government debt has become one of the biggest burdens on China's economy, and the problem of high-rise housing are merely one of the many symptoms. Beyond policy-driven factors, some economic analysts argue that the mass construction of high-rises is driven by massive profits for the government and developers.
There was never a real need to build so many high-rises. So why did it happen? Because the government and developers wanted to cash out quickly. This model is just borrowing against 20 years of future growth. Now, cities must focus on urban renewal. If we keep building, there won't be enough people to live in these homes. They'll just sit empty, as many already are. Yet, some still believe that new homes are selling out. In reality, they're just adding to growing unsold inventory. If you don't understand this, how do you expect to make money? That's why I tell people, if you manage to sell your property, take the money and travel abroad. Broaden your horizons. China's high-rise filled cities are the exception, not the norm. Owning an average apartment in Beijing or Shanghai doesn't mean it should be worth 10 million yuan. Travel abroad, and you'll see why. The Chinese Communist Party will keep rolling out stimulus policies to squeeze the last bit of value from real estate. Why? Once new home inventory is clear, unsold secondhand homes will pile up. Meanwhile, the population is shrinking, and there's no sign of people returning to first-tier cities. In this economic downturn, migration in major cities will only resume when the economy recovers. Without it, real estate has no demand. That's why home buyers shouldn't panic. The real problem is for sellers who can't offload their properties. Whether it's high-rises or regular homes, this isn't the right time for ordinary people to buy.
To reduce excess housing inventory, several cities launched New Year home buying promotions during the Chinese New Year holiday to attract buyers. According to a January 31st report from Chinese news outlet The Paper, the Nanjing Real Estate Association announced that a housing promotion campaign would run from December 27, 2024 to February 28, 2025, covering both New Year's Day and Chinese New Year. Other cities in Jiangsu province, such as Suzhou and Lianyungang, also introduced holiday home buying incentives, offering discounted properties, premium listings, and even free scenic attraction tickets as part of the package. To attract buyers for high-rise apartments, the Chinese government has introduced various measures, but so far they offer little real impact. First, new residential construction. In 2021, China's Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development introduced new standards capping residential building heights at 80 meters. For residential projects exceeding 80 meters and public buildings exceeding 100 meters, approval from local fire departments is required. However, compared to past high-rise construction standards, this change represents only a slight reduction in building heights. Second, renovation of existing high-rises. Urban renewal projects for older residential communities are currently underway, including adding elevators, upgrading and replacing pipelines, waterproofing and structural repairs, landscaping improvements, and enhancing fire safety measures. However, financing these upgrades remain a major challenge. Many local governments require residents to fund these renovations themselves, making large-scale implementation difficult. The alternative, government-funded renovations, is constrained by limited financial resources. So far, these efforts have focused primarily on apartments built in the 1980s and 1990s, leaving newer high-rises from the 2000s facing potential crisis after 2030. Key unresolved issues include the availability of housing maintenance funds, the government's ability to finance renovations, and incentives for private investment in urban renewal. At present, there are no clear solutions to these issues. Finally, demolition and reconstruction of aging housing. Some regions have already begun demolishing and rebuilding older residential areas. Over the coming decades, a large number of urban housing units in China will need to be torn down and reconstructed. However, if local governments fail to break free from their dependence on land finance, and if the 70-year property lease system remains unchanged, then urban development could fall into an even deeper crisis, making large-scale reconstruction unsustainable.